Somewhere on a rocky peninsula jutting into the Mediterranean Sea, a few 100,000 people once looked up at the night sky and decided to ask questions that no one had ever dared to ask in quite the same way before. Why does the sun rise? What happens when we die? What is justice? What is beauty? Why do the planets move the way they do? And in trying to answer those questions, they built a civilization so influential that 2,500 years later, you are still living inside the world they imagined. Every time you vote, you are echoing a word the Greeks invented. Every time you sit in a theater, you are sitting in a space they designed. Every time you use the word atom, or the word planet, or the word philosophy, you are speaking Greek without realizing it. And every time you hear a story about a hero who is brave but flawed, a villain who is monstrous but pitiable, or a god who is powerful but petty, you are hearing an echo of myths that were first told around fires on Greek hillsides thousands of years ago. This is the story of how a small, mountainous, resource-poor stretch of land at the edge of the known world became the engine room of Western civilization, and how the gods, monsters, and heroes its people imagined became some of the most enduring characters in human storytelling. To understand how any of this happened, we first need to understand the land itself, because in Greece, geography is destiny. If you look at a map of Greece, the first thing you notice is that it barely seems to be land at all. It looks like someone took a single landmass and shattered it into hundreds of pieces, scattering them across a deep blue sea. The mainland is carved up by mountain ranges running in almost every direction, splitting the country into small, isolated pockets of farmland separated by jagged peaks. Nearly 80% of Greece is mountainous, and in ancient times, those mountains were nearly impossible to cross with carts or large armies. A farmer in one valley might have more in common, culturally, with someone living 300 miles away across the sea than with a neighbor on the other side of a mountain ridge. This single geographical fact explains an enormous amount about how Greek civilization developed. Instead of forming one unified kingdom, the way Egypt did along the Nile, or the way Mesopotamian empires did along the Tigris and Euphrates, Greece fractured into hundreds of small, independent communities, each one fiercely protective of its own identity, its own laws, its own gods, and its own way of life. But if the mountains divided Greece, the sea connected it. The Aegean Sea, that bright turquoise expanse between the Greek mainland and the coast of modern-day Turkey, was dotted with islands so close together that on a clear day, a sailor could often see the next island before losing sight of the last one. This meant that even though Greek communities were politically fragmented, they were never truly isolated. Ideas, goods, religious practices, and stories moved easily by sea, even when armies could not move easily by land. A trader from Athens could sail to Crete, then to Egypt, then to the coast of Anatolia, picking up myths, artistic styles, and technologies along the way, while a farmer just 30 miles inland might never leave his own valley in his entire life. This created a strange and powerful tension that runs through the entire story of ancient Greece, a tension between fierce local independence and a shared cultural world that stretched across the sea. The Greeks called this shared world, by extension, the lands where Greek was spoken and Greek gods were worshipped, even when those lands were separated by water, mountains, and sometimes outright hostility between neighboring cities. This geography also shaped the Greek relationship with the sea itself, and with the unpredictable, often violent natural world around them. Earthquakes regularly shook the islands. Volcanic eruptions, like the catastrophic explosion of the island of Thera, which we now call Santorini, could bury entire towns and send tsunamis crashing across the Aegean. Sudden storms could destroy a fleet of ships in an afternoon. Droughts could ruin a harvest overnight. In a world this unpredictable, it made a certain kind of sense to imagine that behind every earthquake, every storm, every good harvest, and every plague, there were powerful, emotional, and often unpredictable beings making decisions, the way a parent might make decisions that affect a household, sometimes wisely, sometimes out of anger, jealousy, or pride. This is where Greek mythology begins, not as a neat set of bedtime stories, but as an attempt to explain a world that often felt chaotic, dangerous, and deeply alive. According to the earliest Greek storytellers, in the beginning, there was nothing but chaos, a vast, formless void, not chaos in the sense of disorder and noise as we use the word today, but an empty gap, a yawning space before anything existed at all. Out of this void emerged the first true beings. Gaia, the earth itself, broad-chested and ancient, formed as a solid foundation beneath everything that would come after. Tartarus, a deep, dark abyss far below the earth, a kind of cosmic basement that would later become a prison for the most dangerous beings in the universe. And Eros, the primal force of love and desire, the binding energy that would pull other beings together and set creation into motion. From chaos also came Erebus, the personification of darkness, and Nyx, the personification of night, two beings whose union would produce a whole family of dark and powerful forces, including Hypnos, the god of sleep, and Thanatos, the god of death, beings who would quietly shape the fate of every mortal who ever lived. Gaia, the earth, did not remain alone for long. On her own, without any partner, she gave birth to Uranus, the sky, who stretched out above her and surrounded her completely, and to Pontus, the sea, and to the mountains. Then Gaia and Uranus came together, and from their union came an extraordinary generation of beings called the Titans. There were 12 of them in the original generation, 6 male and 6 female, enormous, powerful beings who would rule the cosmos before the gods we know today, the Olympians, ever existed. Among them were Cronus, who would become the most important of all the Titans, Rhea, Oceanus, the personification of the great river that the Greeks believed encircled the entire world, Hyperion, a Titan of light, and Themis, who represented divine law and order, an idea that would echo through Greek civilization for thousands of years in their courts, their councils, and their endless debates about justice. But Gaia and Uranus did not only produce the Titans, they also gave birth to monstrous children, beings so powerful and strange that Uranus became afraid of them. There were the 3 Cyclopes, gigantic one-eyed beings with incredible strength who would later become master craftsmen, forging weapons of immense power. And there were the Hecatonchires, 100-handed giants of almost unimaginable strength. Uranus, horrified by these children and fearful of being overthrown, did something that would set the entire mythological saga in motion. He pushed these children back into the body of Gaia, imprisoning them inside the earth itself. Gaia, enraged at the suffering this caused her, decided that her husband had to be stopped. She crafted a great sickle made of a hard gray metal, and she went to her Titan children, asking if any of them had the courage to use it against their father. Only one answered the call. Cronus, the youngest and most ambitious of the Titans, took the sickle from his mother. According to the old stories, when Uranus next came to lie with Gaia, Cronus ambushed him and castrated him with the sickle, a brutal act that severed the sky from the earth and ended Uranus's reign over the cosmos. From the blood that fell from this wound, new beings were born, including the giants and the Furies, terrifying spirits of vengeance who would later punish those who broke the most sacred oaths, especially oaths made to family. And from the sea foam, where the severed parts of Uranus fell into the ocean, a new goddess emerged, rising from the waves fully formed. This was Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, born not from a gentle union, but from an act of violence, a detail that the Greeks themselves found both beautiful and unsettling, and one that hints at a recurring theme in their mythology, the idea that creation and destruction, love and violence, are often tangled together in ways that cannot be cleanly separated. With Uranus defeated, Cronus took control of the cosmos, and the age of the Titans began. Cronus took his sister Rhea as his wife, and the two of them ruled together, with Cronus as the supreme power. But Cronus had learned something important from his own rise to power, something that would haunt him for the rest of his reign. He had overthrown his own father. And he became terrified that one of his own children might do the same to him. So when Rhea began giving birth to their children, Cronus did something almost unthinkable. As each child was born, he swallowed them whole, trapping them alive inside his own body, believing this would prevent any of them from ever growing up to challenge him. One by one, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon disappeared down their father's throat, swallowed at birth, while Rhea watched in horror, unable to stop him. By the time Rhea was pregnant with her sixth child, she had had enough. She fled to the island of Crete, and when the child, a son, was born, she hid him away in a cave on Mount Ida, leaving him in the care of nymphs and protective spirits who raised him in secret, disguising the sounds of his crying with the clashing of shields and the dance of armed guards so that Cronus would not hear him. Then Rhea took a stone, wrapped it in cloth to resemble a newborn baby, and gave it to Cronus. Cronus, without checking, swallowed the stone, believing he had consumed his sixth child just as he had the others. The child who had been hidden away grew up on Crete, strong, clever, and increasingly aware of the injustice his father had committed against his siblings, who were still trapped, alive, inside Cronus. That child's name was Zeus, and his story would soon change the shape of the universe forever. Zeus grew up far from his father's gaze, on the slopes of a mountain on Crete, fed on the milk of a divine goat, and guarded by warriors whose clattering weapons drowned out any sound that might give away his hiding place. As he grew into adulthood, he became aware of the terrible situation his siblings were trapped in, swallowed alive inside their own father, and he decided that this could not continue. With the help of his mother Rhea, and according to some versions of the story, with the help of a clever titaness named Metis, Zeus arranged for Cronus to drink a potion that caused him to vomit up everything he had swallowed. Out came the stone that had been disguised as a baby, and then, one by one, out came Zeus's siblings, fully grown despite having spent years trapped inside their father, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, blinking in the light of a world they had never truly seen. What followed was a 10-year war that the Greeks called the Titanomachy, the Battle of the Titans, a conflict so vast and violent that it was said to shake the very foundations of the earth. On one side stood Cronus and most of the other Titans, the Old Order, the original ruling family of the cosmos. On the other side stood Zeus and his siblings, the new generation, fighting for their freedom and for control of the universe itself. For years, neither side could gain a decisive advantage. The turning point came when Zeus made an unusual decision. Deep beneath the earth, in the gloomy prison of Tartarus, were the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires, the 100-handed giants that Uranus had once imprisoned and that Cronus had never bothered to release. Zeus freed them, and in gratitude, the Cyclopes forged for him a weapon unlike anything that had existed before, a thunderbolt, a weapon of pure, devastating power that could be thrown like a spear, but struck with the force of the sky itself. With the thunderbolt in hand, and with the 100-handed giants hurling boulders by the hundreds at the Titan forces, the balance of the war shifted decisively. Zeus and his allies defeated Cronus and the Titans who had fought alongside him. The defeated Titans were cast down into Tartarus, the same dark prison that had once held the Cyclopes, and the Hecatonchires were set to guard them there, ensuring they could never escape to challenge the new order. Not every Titan was punished, however. Some, like Themis, the personification of law, and Oceanus, who had remained neutral, were allowed to continue existing peacefully under the new regime, a detail that mattered to the Greeks, who valued the idea that even cosmic conflicts could end with some kind of order and justice rather than total annihilation. With the Titans defeated, Zeus and his siblings divided the universe among themselves. Zeus took the sky and became the supreme ruler of gods and mortals alike, the wielder of the thunderbolt, the god whose word was law on Mount Olympus. Poseidon took the sea, becoming lord of every ocean, river, and earthquake, since the Greeks believed that earthquakes were caused by Poseidon striking the ground with his trident in anger. Hades, the eldest of the brothers, drew the underworld, becoming the ruler of the dead, a position that was not seen as evil exactly, but as solemn, distant, and feared, the keeper of a realm that every mortal would eventually visit. Hestia took on the role of goddess of the hearth, the home, and domestic life, a quieter but deeply important role in a culture where the hearth was the literal and symbolic center of every household. And from this point forward, Mount Olympus, a real mountain in northern Greece, the tallest in the country, became the mythological home of the gods, a place wrapped in clouds and mystery. where the most powerful beings in the universe lived in a kind of divine court, with all the politics, rivalries, romances, and family drama that any royal court might have, except magnified to a cosmic scale. It's worth pausing here to notice something important about how the Greeks imagined their gods. Unlike some other ancient religions where gods were often portrayed as distant, abstract, or purely benevolent forces, the Greek gods were intensely, almost uncomfortably human. They fell in love. They got jealous. They held grudges for generations. They played favorites. They lied to each other. They competed for status. And they meddled in the lives of mortals, not always for noble reasons, but sometimes simply because they were bored, or insulted, or curious. This wasn't a flaw in Greek religious thinking. It was central to it. The gods represented forces of nature and aspects of human experience, but they were imagined with personalities, precisely so that people could tell stories about them. Stories that explored jealousy, pride, love, betrayal, and justice in ways that abstract forces never could. Zeus himself is a perfect example of this. As king of the gods, he represented authority, justice, and the natural order, the god who upheld oaths and punished those who broke the laws of hospitality. But he was also notorious throughout Greek mythology for his countless affairs with goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women, affairs that produced an enormous number of children, many of whom would become major figures in their own right, gods, heroes, and founders of important bloodlines. His wife, Hera, queen of the gods and goddess of marriage and family, spent a significant portion of Greek mythology furious at her husband's infidelities, and her anger often fell not on Zeus himself, who as king of the gods was difficult to punish, but on the women Zeus pursued and the children that resulted from those affairs. This dynamic, an all-powerful but unfaithful husband, and a powerful, vengeful, and often sympathetic wife, gave Greek storytellers an endless source of material, and it also reflected something about how Greek society itself viewed marriage, power, and gender, themes that show up again and again in their myths, their plays, and their daily lives. Athena, who had become one of the most important goddesses in Greek mythology, had an origin story that was as strange as anything else in this mythological world. Zeus, after his rise to power, took as one of his early consorts the Titaness Metis, the same clever being who had helped him defeat Cronus. But a prophecy warned Zeus that Metis would bear a daughter equal to him in wisdom and strength, and then a son who would overthrow him, just as he had overthrown his own father. Determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past, but unwilling to imprison or destroy Metis the way Cronus might have, Zeus instead swallowed Metis whole, absorbing her into himself. Sometime later, Zeus began to suffer from an unbearable headache, and he asked another god, sometimes said to be Hephaestus, the god of the forge, to split his skull open with an axe. When this was done, out sprang Athena, fully grown, fully armed, wearing armor and carrying a spear, the goddess of wisdom, strategy, and civilization itself, born not from a mother's womb, but from her father's mind. This origin story mattered deeply to the Greeks, and especially to the Athenians, who saw in Athena's birth a kind of symbol for their own city, a place that prized intellect, strategy, and civic order above brute force. The family of gods that resulted from these unions, conflicts, and strange births became known as the Olympians, the 12 major gods who ruled from Mount Olympus and who would receive worship across the Greek world for over 1,000 years. Beyond Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Hades, Hestia, and Athena, there was Apollo, the god of the sun, music, poetry, healing, and prophecy, one of the most beloved and complex gods in the entire pantheon, associated above all with the oracle at Delphi, a place we will return to many times throughout this story. There was Artemis, Apollo's twin sister, goddess of the hunt, the wilderness, and the moon, fiercely independent, often portrayed as a protector of young women and wild animals, and famously resistant to marriage in a culture that placed enormous pressure on women to marry. There was Ares, the god of war, who, despite ruling over one of the most important aspects of Greek life, was actually one of the least popular gods among the Greeks themselves, often portrayed as brutal, reckless, and lacking the strategic wisdom that Athena, also a war deity, possessed in abundance. Then there was Aphrodite, the goddess of love, beauty, and desire, born from the sea foam, in that strange and violent origin we described earlier. A goddess whose influence the Greeks believed could topple kingdoms, start wars, and drive both gods and mortals to acts of incredible passion or incredible foolishness. There was Hermes, the messenger god, quick-witted, clever, and more than a little mischievous, associated with travelers, merchants, thieves, and the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead, since it was Hermes who guided souls down to the underworld. There was Demeter, goddess of the harvest and agriculture, whose moods, according to myth, directly affected whether crops grew or failed, and whose story would become tied to one of the most important religious mysteries in the ancient world. There was Hephaestus, the god of the forge, fire, and craftsmanship, often portrayed as lame, having been thrown from Olympus as an infant by an embarrassed Hera, but whose skill with metal and fire made him responsible for crafting weapons, armor, and magical objects for gods and heroes alike. And finally, in some versions of the pantheon, Dionysus, the god of wine, festivity, theater, and ecstatic, boundary-breaking experiences, took a seat among the 12, often replacing Hestia in later traditions, reflecting how important the worship of Dionysus, and the theater that grew out of it, would become to Greek culture. Beneath this family of gods existed an entire world of lesser deities and spirits that touched every part of Greek life. The Fates, three sisters often portrayed spinning, measuring, and cutting a thread that represented each person's life, were so powerful that even Zeus himself was said to respect their decisions, an idea that introduces one of the most important themes in all of Greek storytelling, the tension between fate and free will, a tension we will explore in depth later. The Muses, 9 goddesses of music, poetry, history, and the arts, were believed to inspire poets, musicians, and storytellers, which is why ancient Greek poems so often begin with an invocation asking a muse for inspiration. And ruling over the underworld alongside Hades was Persephone, a goddess whose story, involving her abduction by Hades and her mother Demeter's grief-stricken search for her, would become one of the most influential myths in explaining the changing of the seasons, and would form the basis of secret religious rites practiced for centuries at a place called Eleusis, not far from Athens. With the major gods established and Mount Olympus secure, the cosmos the Greeks imagined had taken roughly the shape it would keep for the rest of their civilization's history. But gods alone do not make a mythology complete. Every great mythology needs monsters to be defeated, and the Greek imagination produced some of the most memorable monsters in the history of storytelling, creatures whose names are still instantly recognizable thousands of years later, and whose stories were never just about fear, but about courage, cleverness, and the strange, blurry line between the human and the inhuman. Among the most famous monsters in Greek mythology was Medusa, a figure whose image has survived for thousands of years, carved into shields, painted on pottery, and still recognized instantly today as a woman with snakes for hair whose gaze could turn a person to stone. But the story of Medusa is more complicated and more tragic than most people realize. In some of the earliest versions of her story, Medusa was not born a monster at all. She was a beautiful young woman, a priestess in the temple of Athena, who was assaulted by Poseidon inside that very temple. Athena, furious that her sacred space had been violated, but unable or unwilling to punish a fellow god, instead transformed Medusa into a monster, cursing her with serpents for hair and a gaze that turned anyone who looked at her to stone. Medusa was then exiled to a remote island with her 2 monstrous sisters, the Gorgons, where she lived in isolation until a hero named Perseus, whose story we will return to, was sent to kill her, eventually using her severed head as a weapon before giving it to Athena, who placed it on her own shield as a symbol of protection. The story of Medusa raises uncomfortable questions that the Greeks themselves seemed aware of. Questions about victims being punished, while the powerful go unpunished. Questions that, remarkably, still resonate with audiences today. Then there was the Minotaur, a creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull, born from an unnatural union between a queen and a bull sent by Poseidon, and imprisoned beneath the palace of King Minos on the island of Crete inside an enormous maze called the Labyrinth, designed by the legendary craftsman Daedalus so cleverly that no one who entered could ever find their way back out. Every 9 years, according to the myth, Athens was forced to send a tribute of young men and women to Crete, where they would be sent into the labyrinth to be devoured by the Minotaur, until the Athenian hero Theseus volunteered to go himself, determined to end the cycle of sacrifice once and for all. We will follow Theseus's journey into the labyrinth later, but the Minotaur myth is worth pausing on now, because many historians believe it may actually be a distorted cultural memory of something real. A memory of the enormous, maze-like palaces built by an actual Bronze Age civilization that once dominated Crete, a civilization whose ruins, when rediscovered thousands of years later, would seem to confirm that the myths the Greeks told about their distant past were not pure fantasy, but exaggerated, mythologized memories of real places and real events. Guarding the entrance to the underworld was Cerberus, a massive, multi-headed dog, often described as having 3 heads, though some ancient sources describe even more, along with a mane of snakes and a serpent for a tail. Cerberus's job was simple but absolute: to ensure that the dead could enter the underworld but never leave, and that the living could never enter without divine permission. Only a handful of mythological figures ever managed to get past Cerberus, including the musician Orpheus, who charmed the beast with his music in a desperate attempt to bring his wife back from the dead, and the hero Heracles, who as one of his legendary labors was tasked with capturing Cerberus alive and bringing him to the surface world, a task he accomplished through sheer strength rather than trickery, wrestling the enormous beast into submission with his bare hands. The Hydra was another creature closely tied to the story of Heracles, a serpent-like monster with multiple heads, said to live in a swamp near the city of Lerna. What made the Hydra so dangerous wasn't just its poisonous breath and blood, but the fact that if you cut off one of its heads, 2 more would grow in its place, making it seem almost impossible to defeat through ordinary combat. Heracles eventually solved this problem not through strength alone, but through a combination of strength and strategy, having his companion cauterize each neck with fire immediately after he cut off a head, preventing new heads from growing back. This detail matters because it reflects something the Greeks valued enormously: the idea that brute force alone is rarely enough, that even the strongest heroes need cleverness, and that the most dangerous problems often require creative solutions rather than simply hitting them harder. The Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants we encountered earlier as the children of Gaia and Uranus who helped forge Zeus's thunderbolt, also appear in a very different and much later context, in the story of Odysseus, where a Cyclops named Polyphemus traps Odysseus and his crew in a cave, eating several of them before Odysseus blinds him with a sharpened stake and escapes by clinging to the underside of Polyphemus's sheep. This story, found in the Odyssey, shows how the same mythological creatures could appear in completely different stories, centuries apart, taking on new meanings depending on the context, sometimes as primordial cosmic forces, sometimes as terrifying obstacles for human heroes to outwit. Then there were the sirens, creatures often imagined as part woman and part bird, who lived on rocky islands and lured passing sailors to their deaths with the irresistible beauty of their singing, a song so captivating that sailors would steer their ships directly into the rocks just to get closer to the sound. Odysseus famously survived an encounter with the sirens by having his crew plug their ears with wax, while he himself, curious to hear their song and survive, had himself tied tightly to the mast of his ship, ordering his crew not to release him no matter how much he begged. The sirens have become such a powerful cultural symbol that the word itself, used today for warning alarms, comes directly from this myth, a reminder of how deeply these ancient stories are embedded in our everyday language, even when we don't realize it. What's striking about all of these monsters is that almost none of them are simply evil for the sake of being evil. Medusa is a victim, transformed into a monster by divine punishment. The Minotaur is the tragic result of a king's broken promise to the gods. The Hydra and Cerberus are guardians and obstacles, rather than malicious villains seeking to destroy humanity. Even the Cyclopes and the Sirens have understandable, if dangerous, motivations: hunger, isolation, the desire to be heard. This complexity is part of what makes Greek mythology so enduring. The monsters aren't just there to be killed, they're there to test the heroes, to raise questions about justice, mercy, cleverness, and the cost of survival, and often to hold up a slightly distorted mirror to human society itself. And it's here, at the edge between myth and history, between monsters and maze-like palaces, that we need to step away from pure mythology for a while and turn to something the Greeks themselves believed in deeply: the idea that their myths were rooted in a real past, a past that archaeologists, starting in the late 19th century, would begin digging up out of the earth, quite literally, on the island of Crete and on the Greek mainland, uncovering the remains of civilizations so advanced and so mysterious that even today we are still piecing together exactly who these people were and how their world gave rise to the myths that the later Greeks told about heroes, monsters, and kings. The island of Crete, the largest island in the Aegean, sitting almost exactly where the myths placed King Minos and his labyrinth, turned out to be home to one of the earliest and most sophisticated civilizations in European history, a civilization that flourished roughly 4,000 years ago, centuries before the Greece of Socrates, Sparta, or the Parthenon ever existed. This civilization is now called Minoan, a name that comes directly from the legendary King Minos, even though we don't actually know what these people called themselves, since their writing, a script we now call Linear A, has never been fully deciphered. What we do know comes from the spectacular ruins they left behind, especially at a site called Knossos on the northern coast of Crete, where archaeologists uncovered the remains of an enormous palace complex covering several acres, with hundreds of interconnected rooms, storage areas, workshops, and courtyards. A structure so vast and confusing to navigate that it's easy to understand why later Greeks, encountering its ruins centuries after it had been abandoned, might have remembered it as a labyrinth, a maze built to contain a monster. The Minoans were not warriors in the way later Greek city-states would be. Their palaces, unlike the heavily fortified citadels we'll soon encounter on the mainland, were largely unfortified, suggesting a society that felt relatively secure, likely because of the natural protection provided by the sea and a powerful navy that allowed them to dominate trade across the Aegean without needing massive walls around their cities. Minoan art, found in vibrant frescoes painted directly onto the walls of their palaces, shows us a society that seems, at least on the surface, remarkably different from the later, more militaristic Greek world. We see images of young men and women vaulting over the backs of charging bulls in a ritual sport sometimes called bull leaping, a dangerous and probably ceremonial activity that may have inspired the later myth of the Minotaur and the bull that Poseidon sent to Crete. We see elegant, brightly dressed figures, dolphins leaping through painted seas, and elaborate processions, all rendered with a fluid, naturalistic style that feels almost playful compared to the more rigid, formal art that would come later in Greek history. The Minoans were also master traders, with evidence of their goods, particularly pottery and luxury items, showing up as far away as Egypt and the Levant, indicating a vast trading network that connected Crete to the major civilizations of the ancient Near East. This trade brought wealth, but it also brought cultural exchange, and many historians believe that some Minoan religious practices, artistic styles, and even mythological ideas may have influenced the Greek mainland civilizations that would eventually surpass them. But around the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, something happened to Minoan civilization that historians and archaeologists still debate today. The island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, located not far from Crete, experienced one of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded human history. An explosion so massive that it buried the Minoan settlement on Thera under meters of ash, preserving it in a way eerily similar to how Pompeii would later be preserved by Mount Vesuvius, and sent tsunamis crashing into the northern coast of Crete. While this eruption likely did not single-handedly destroy Minoan civilization, since Knossos continued to be occupied for some time afterward, it almost certainly weakened Minoan society, disrupting trade routes, damaging coastal settlements, and possibly creating the kind of crisis that left Crete vulnerable to a new power that was rising on the Greek mainland, a power whose people we now call the Mycenaeans, and whose stories would become the foundation for the most famous war in all of Greek mythology. While the Minoans were building their unfortified palaces and painting their playful frescoes on Crete, a very different kind of civilization was developing on the Greek mainland, particularly in the region known as the Peloponnese, the large peninsula connected to the rest of Greece by a narrow strip of land. This civilization, which we call Mycenaean after its most famous city, Mycenae, was, in almost every way, the opposite of the Minoan world. Where the Minoans built open palaces protected by the sea, the Mycenaeans built massive fortified citadels with walls so thick and made of stones so enormous that later Greeks, looking at the ruins of these walls centuries afterward, assumed they must have been built by the Cyclopes, since no ordinary human effort seemed capable of moving stones that size. This is actually where we get the modern archaeological term Cyclopean masonry, used to describe construction using huge, roughly fitted stone blocks, a direct reference to the myth that grew up around these very real, very impressive ruins. The Mycenaeans were warriors, and their graves tell us so in dramatic fashion. When archaeologists excavated royal burial sites at Mycenae, they found bodies covered in gold, including a series of gold funeral masks so finely crafted that one of them, when first discovered in the 19th century, was famously and incorrectly identified by its excavator as the death mask of Agamemnon himself, the legendary king who would lead the Greek forces against Troy. While that particular identification turned out to be centuries too early to actually be Agamemnon, the sheer wealth and craftsmanship found in these graves tells us that Mycenaean society was dominated by powerful warrior kings, men who were buried with weapons, armor, and treasure befitting rulers who saw warfare, raiding, and conquest as central to their identity and their economy. By around 1450 BCE, the Mycenaeans had taken control of Crete itself, occupying Knossos and adapting the Minoan writing system into a new script we call Linear B, which, unlike Linear A, has actually been deciphered, and which turns out to be an early form of Greek. This is one of the most important discoveries in the entire history of Greek archaeology, because it proves that the Mycenaeans were, in a very real sense, the first Greeks. The earliest people we can definitively say spoke a language ancestral to the Greek that Homer, Socrates, and Plato would later write and speak. The tablets written in Linear B that have survived are mostly administrative records, lists of goods, taxes, and offerings to gods, which might sound boring, but which actually give us an incredible window into Mycenaean society, including the names of several gods we recognize immediately from later Greek mythology, including Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, and even Dionysus, proving that these gods were already being worshipped centuries before the Greece of the city-states existed. The Mycenaean world reached its peak during what we call the Late Bronze Age, a period when several major civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, including the Egyptians, the Hittites, in what is now Turkey, and various Mesopotamian powers, were all interconnected through trade, diplomacy, and occasionally warfare. It's into this world, this network of powerful Bronze Age kingdoms trading goods and occasionally going to war with each other, that the most famous story in all of Greek mythology is set, the story of the Trojan War. According to myth, the chain of events that led to the Trojan War began not on a battlefield, but at a wedding, specifically a wedding that one particular goddess was deliberately not invited to. The goddess Eris, whose name literally means strife or discord, was excluded from the wedding feast of the hero Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis, a wedding attended by nearly every major god and goddess. Furious at being left out, Eris took revenge in a way that perfectly suited her nature. She threw a golden apple into the middle of the wedding feast, inscribed with the words for the fairest, and then left, knowing exactly what chaos this small object would cause. 3 goddesses immediately claimed the apple for themselves: Hera, queen of the gods; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Unable to resolve the dispute themselves, and unwilling to risk angering 2 of the goddesses by choosing the third, the gods decided that a mortal should judge the contest. The mortal chosen for this task was a Trojan prince named Paris, a young man tending sheep on Mount Ida near the city of Troy, completely unaware that his decision was about to set in motion a war that would last 10 years and destroy his entire city. Each goddess tried to bribe Paris to choose her. Hera offered him political power, promising to make him ruler over vast territories. Athena offered him wisdom and skill in battle, promising he would become the greatest warrior in the world. But Aphrodite offered him something more personal, the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, perhaps predictably for a young man, chose Aphrodite, and in doing so, earned the eternal favor of the goddess of love, but also the eternal hatred of Hera and Athena, two of the most powerful beings in the universe, a hatred that would follow Troy for the rest of its existence. The most beautiful woman in the world, according to Aphrodite, was a woman named Helen, and there was one significant problem with Aphrodite's promise. Helen was already married to a Greek king named Menelaus, the ruler of Sparta. Helen herself had an extraordinary background. She was said to be a daughter of Zeus, born after Zeus transformed into a swan and approached her mother, and her beauty was so famous that, before her marriage, kings and princes from across Greece had traveled to compete for her hand. To prevent the inevitable conflict that would arise when one man won and all the others lost, Helen's stepfather had required every suitor to swear a solemn oath, an oath to defend the marriage of whoever Helen chose. No matter what happened in the future, Helen eventually married Menelaus, and the other suitors, bound by their oath, returned to their own kingdoms. When Paris, guided and assisted by Aphrodite, traveled to Sparta and either persuaded Helen to leave with him willingly or, in some versions of the story, abducted her outright, he triggered that ancient oath. Menelaus, humiliated and furious, called upon every king who had sworn to defend his marriage, and one by one, the great kings and warriors of Greece answered the call, gathering an enormous fleet and army. With Menelaus's brother Agamemnon, the powerful king of Mycenae, taking overall command of the expedition. Among the warriors who joined this expedition was a young man named Achilles, the son of that same Peleus and Thetis, whose wedding had started this entire chain of events, a warrior whose mother, the sea nymph Thetis, had tried desperately to make him immortal, dipping him as an infant into the river Styx, the river that separated the world of the living from the underworld. According to the most famous version of this story, Thetis held Achilles by his heel as she dipped him, and that single heel, the only part of his body untouched by the magical water, remained vulnerable, a detail that would prove fatally important later in the war, and that has given us the modern phrase Achilles' heel, used to this day to describe a single, critical weakness in someone or something otherwise nearly invincible. The Greek fleet, gathered at the port of Aulis, was massive, and according to the myths, before it could even set sail, it required a sacrifice. The wind needed to carry the ships to Troy refused to blow, and the priests determined that the goddess Artemis was angry, demanding that Agamemnon sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia, in exchange for favorable winds. In the most common version of this story, Agamemnon, faced with an impossible choice between his daughter's life and his command of the entire expedition, chose to sacrifice Iphigenia, a decision that some versions of the myth say was never fully forgiven by his wife Clytemnestra, and that would have devastating consequences for Agamemnon's entire family for years to come. Consequences that later Greek playwrights would explore in some of the most powerful tragedies ever written. The Trojan War itself, as described in the Iliad, the epic poem traditionally attributed to a poet named Homer, did not actually cover the entire 10-year conflict. Instead, the Iliad focuses on just a few weeks near the end of the war, and centers not primarily on the war itself, but on a quarrel between Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek forces, and Achilles, their greatest warrior. The quarrel begins when Agamemnon takes a captive woman, Briseis, who had been awarded to Achilles as a prize of war. Insulted, Achilles withdraws from the fighting entirely, refusing to take part in the battle, and without their greatest warrior, the Greek forces begin to suffer devastating losses at the hands of the Trojans, led by their prince Hector, the noble and tragic brother of Paris. What makes the Iliad so remarkable, and why it has remained one of the most studied and admired works of literature for nearly 3,000 years, is that it refuses to portray either side as simply good or evil. Hector, the Trojan champion, is shown as a loving husband and father, a man who fights not for glory, but to protect his city and his family, knowing all along that Troy is doomed to fall. The gods themselves take sides, with Hera, Athena, and Poseidon supporting the Greeks, largely out of lingering resentment over the judgment of Paris, while Aphrodite, Apollo, and Ares support the Trojans. And Achilles, the greatest of all Greek heroes, is shown not as a flawless paragon of virtue, but as a man consumed by pride, grief, and rage, whose personal anger directly causes the deaths of countless men on his own side. The turning point of the Iliad comes when Hector, in battle, kills Achilles' closest companion, Patroclus, while Patroclus is wearing Achilles' own armor. Overwhelmed with grief and guilt, Achilles finally returns to battle, not for Greece, not for Agamemnon, but for revenge. In one of the most famous confrontations in all of literature, Achilles hunts down Hector outside the walls of Troy and kills him, then drags his body behind his chariot in a display of rage that shocks even the gods watching from Olympus. The Iliad ends not with the fall of Troy itself, but with an extraordinarily human moment. King Priam of Troy, Hector's father, traveling under cover of night to the Greek camp to beg Achilles for the return of his son's body, and Achilles, in a moment of unexpected compassion, agreeing, allowing both sides a brief truce to mourn their dead, a reminder that even amid the brutality of war, the Greeks valued moments of shared grief and basic human dignity. The actual fall of Troy is not described in the Iliad itself, but in later works and traditions, including the famous story of the Trojan horse, a massive wooden horse built by the Greeks, supposedly as an offering to the gods, but secretly hollow and filled with armed Greek soldiers. The Trojans, believing the Greeks had finally given up and sailed home, brought the horse inside their city walls as a trophy, and that night, the hidden soldiers emerged, opened the gates for the rest of the Greek army, and Troy, a city that had withstood 10 years of siege, fell in a single night, burned to the ground, its men killed, its women and children taken as slaves, and its royal family largely wiped out, with only a handful of survivors, including a Trojan prince named Aeneas, who, according to later Roman tradition, would go on to found the line that eventually led to the founding of Rome itself, a thread that connects Greek mythology directly to the later Roman world we'll return to at the very end of this story. If the Iliad is a story about anger and its consequences, the Odyssey, the second great epic attributed to Homer, is a story about the long, difficult journey home, and it follows one of the Greek heroes who survived the fall of Troy, a king named Odysseus, ruler of a small island called Ithaca, famous not for his physical strength, but for his cleverness, his resourcefulness, and his ability to talk his way out of almost any situation. While most of the Greek leaders who survived Troy made it home relatively quickly, Odysseus's journey took 10 years, an entire decade of wandering, shipwrecks, monsters, and divine interference, largely because he had angered Poseidon, god of the sea, by blinding his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, during an encounter we mentioned earlier. The Odyssey takes Odysseus and his crew through one of the most imaginative sequences of encounters in all of ancient literature. They visit the land of the Lotus Eaters, where some of his men eat a fruit that makes them forget their home entirely and want to stay forever, content and apathetic, until Odysseus forces them back onto the ships. They encounter the witch goddess Circe, who transforms part of his crew into pigs, and whom Odysseus must outwit and eventually befriend in order to free his men and continue his journey. He travels to the edge of the underworld itself, summoning the spirits of the dead, including his own mother, who had died of grief while waiting for his return, and the spirit of Achilles, who tells Odysseus that he would rather be a living man working as a poor laborer than a king ruling over all the dead, a striking statement that reveals how the Greeks generally viewed the afterlife, not as a glorious paradise, but as a dim, joyless shadow of life, a perspective that helps explain why Greek culture placed such enormous value on achieving glory and being remembered while alive, since the alternative, in their view, was a kind of permanent twilight existence. Odysseus's journey also takes him past the Sirens, whose song we already discussed, and through a narrow strait, guarded on either side by two monsters, Scylla, a many-headed sea monster that snatches sailors from passing ships, and Charybdis, a massive whirlpool capable of swallowing an entire vessel. Forced to choose between losing a few men to Scylla or risking his entire ship to Charybdis, Odysseus chooses to sacrifice a few sailors rather than everyone. A brutal but pragmatic decision that reflects the often harsh moral calculus found throughout Greek storytelling, where survival sometimes requires choices that are not heroic in any simple sense, but necessary. Eventually, having lost his entire crew and his ships, Odysseus is held for years on the island of the nymph Calypso, who falls in love with him and offers him immortality if he stays with her forever. An offer Odysseus ultimately refuses, choosing instead the difficult mortal life of returning home to his wife Penelope and his kingdom. When Odysseus finally returns to Ithaca, disguised as a beggar so as not to be recognized, he finds his home overrun by suitors, men who have been pressuring his wife to remarry, believing Odysseus to be dead, and who have spent years living off his household's wealth while waiting for Penelope to choose one of them. Penelope herself, in one of the most admired displays of cleverness in the entire epic, has spent years delaying this decision by claiming she must finish weaving a burial shroud before she can remarry, only to secretly unravel her work each night, buying herself and her husband more time. The Odyssey ends with Odysseus, still disguised, participating in a contest the suitors cannot win, stringing his own great bow, and shooting an arrow through a row of axe handles, a feat none of the suitors can match. Revealing his true identity, Odysseus, along with his son Telemachus, then takes brutal revenge on the suitors who had disrespected his household for years, restoring order to his kingdom, and reuniting with Penelope after 20 years apart, 10 spent fighting at Troy, and 10 spent journeying home. The Odyssey, in many ways, is as much a story about home, identity, and patience as it is an adventure story, and its themes of cleverness triumphing over brute force, and of loyalty being tested but ultimately rewarded, would resonate throughout Greek culture for centuries. Now, here's where things get genuinely fascinating from a historical perspective. For a very long time, educated people in the Western world assumed that Troy, Mycenae, Agamemnon, and the entire Trojan War were pure invention, beautiful poetry with no historical basis whatsoever. Then, in the 1870s, a wealthy and somewhat controversial German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann, using clues from the Iliad itself, almost like a treasure map, began excavating a mound in northwestern Turkey at a site called Hisarlik and discovered the remains of an ancient city with multiple layers of construction and destruction stacked on top of each other across thousands of years, one of which had been violently destroyed by fire around the time the Trojan War was traditionally supposed to have occurred. Schliemann, and many archaeologists after him, became convinced this was Troy. This doesn't mean the Iliad is a literal historical record. The gods, the 10-year siege, Achilles' near invincibility, these are clearly the elements of epic poetry, not history. But it does suggest something remarkable, that buried within these myths, passed down orally for centuries before they were ever written down, there may be genuine memories of real conflicts, real cities, and real destructions that occurred during the Late Bronze Age, memories that were gradually transformed, exaggerated, and woven together with religious and mythological elements over hundreds of years of retelling, until the line between history and legend became almost impossible to separate. This is actually a pattern we see across many ancient cultures, real events becoming the seeds of myth. And it's one of the reasons Greek mythology has remained so compelling, because underneath the fantastical elements, there often seems to be something real, something that actually happened to actual people. And the Late Bronze Age city that may have inspired the story of Troy was destroyed during a period of absolutely catastrophic upheaval across the entire Eastern Mediterranean, a period that historians sometimes simply call the Bronze Age collapse, one of the most dramatic and least understood disasters in ancient history. Around 1200 BCE, Within a relatively short span of time, nearly every major civilization in the region experienced sudden violent destruction or steep decline. The Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the ancient Near East, collapsed entirely. Numerous cities across the eastern Mediterranean were burned and abandoned. Egypt, though it survived, was severely weakened, and Egyptian records from this period describe attacks by groups of seafaring raiders that modern historians call the Sea Peoples, though their exact identity remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of ancient history. And the Mycenaean civilization, the very civilization that produced the gold masks, the Cyclopean walls, and quite possibly the historical kernel behind the legends of Agamemnon and the Trojan War, did not escape this collapse either. One by one, the great Mycenaean palace centers were destroyed, many by fire, and were never rebuilt on the same scale again. The complex administrative systems that had produced those linear B tablets vanished. Long-distance trade networks collapsed. Writing itself disappeared from Greece entirely. The alphabet would not return for several centuries, and when it did, it would be a completely different writing system, borrowed and adapted from the Phoenicians. Population levels dropped dramatically. The grand palaces, the centralized kingdoms, the wealth, all of it crumbled within just a few generations. What caused the Bronze Age collapse remains hotly debated among historians, and no single explanation seems to fully account for the scale and speed of the destruction. Some point to climate change. Evidence suggests this period saw a series of severe droughts that could have caused widespread famine and put enormous strain on agricultural societies already operating close to their limits. Others point to the Sea Peoples, whoever they were, possibly displaced populations themselves, fleeing crisis elsewhere, who may have raided and destabilized coastal cities across the region. Still others point to internal factors, earthquakes, which the region is certainly prone to, social unrest, or the simple fact that these Bronze Age palace economies were so interconnected and interdependent that the collapse of one major trading partner could trigger a cascading failure across the entire system, not unlike how modern economic crises can spread rapidly between interconnected countries. Most historians today believe it was probably a combination of several of these factors, a perfect storm of climate stress, famine, migration, warfare, and systems collapse, all hitting at roughly the same time, with each crisis making the others worse. For Greece specifically, the result of this collapse was a period that historians call the Greek Dark Ages, lasting roughly from 1100 to 800 BCE, a span of around 300 years about which we know remarkably little, precisely because writing had disappeared and the grand building projects of the Mycenaean era had stopped. Population declined sharply. People abandoned the large palace centers and lived in smaller, more scattered communities. Pottery from this period is generally simpler and less elaborate than what came before. For a long time, this period was seen by historians purely as a catastrophe, a dark age in the most literal sense, a time of cultural and economic regression. But more recent archaeology has revealed that the Greek Dark Ages, while certainly a time of disruption and decline compared to the Mycenaean palace era, were not simply empty centuries of nothing happening. This was actually a period of crucial transformation, during which the rigid, centralized, palace-dominated society of the Mycenaeans gradually gave way to something genuinely new, smaller, more independent communities organized around extended family groups and local leaders, communities that would, over the following centuries, slowly grow into the city-states, the polis, that would define the Greece we usually think of when we imagine ancient Greece, the Greece of Athens and Sparta, of democracy and philosophy, of the Parthenon and the Olympic Games. It was also during this period, scholars believe, that the oral traditions that would eventually become the Iliad and the Odyssey were being shaped, refined, and passed down from generation to generation. Storytellers preserving memories of a lost golden age of heroes and palaces, memories that, by the time writing returned to Greece and these poems were finally written down, had been transformed into the foundational epics of an entire civilization. The Dark Ages, in other words, were not an ending. They were a kind of cocoon, a quiet, difficult period during which the seeds of classical Greece were slowly germinating beneath the surface, waiting for the right conditions to burst back into the light. By around 800 BCE, Greece was emerging from its long centuries of obscurity, and a new kind of political organization was taking shape across the Greek world, the polis, or city-state, a model that would define Greek civilization for the next several hundred years. A polis was not just a city in the modern sense. It was an entire self-governing community, typically consisting of an urban center, often built around a fortified hilltop called an acropolis, surrounded by farmland, villages, and territory that its citizens considered their own. Crucially, each polis was politically independent, with its own government, its own laws, its own army, its own currency in many cases, and its own patron deities. There was no single Greek nation in the way we think of countries today. Instead, there were hundreds of these small, fiercely independent communities scattered across the mainland, the islands, and the coast of Anatolia, all speaking dialects of the same language, all worshiping broadly the same gods, all participating in shared religious festivals and competitions like the Olympic Games, but politically separate, and often, as we'll see, willing to go to war with each other. This period also saw a wave of colonization, as many Greek city-states, facing population pressure and limited farmland at home, established colonies across the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. From southern Italy and Sicily, where Greek colonies became so numerous and influential that the region was sometimes called Greater Greece, to the coasts of North Africa, southern France, and the shores of the Black Sea. These colonies were not controlled by their mother cities, the way later colonial empires would control their territories. Instead, they were typically independent polis in their own right, connected to their founding city by shared religious ties, trade relationships, and cultural identity, but politically self-governing. This colonization spread Greek language, religion, and culture across an enormous area, an early version of the kind of cultural influence that, centuries later, Alexander the Great would spread on an even more massive scale. Among all these city-states, a handful would come to dominate Greek history, and none more so than Athens and Sparta, two cities that developed in almost diametrically opposite directions, and whose eventual rivalry would shape the course of Greek history for generations. Athens, located in the region of Attica, began, like most other Greek cities, as a monarchy ruled by kings. Over time, power shifted away from kings toward aristocrats, wealthy landowning families who dominated political life. But Athens, more than almost any other Greek city, would eventually push political power further than any society had before, towards something genuinely revolutionary, ruled by the people themselves. This didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen without conflict. In the early 6th century BCE, Athens was racked by tension between wealthy landowners and ordinary farmers, many of whom had fallen into debt so severe that some had been forced into a kind of debt slavery, working land that had once been their own merely to survive. To address this crisis, the Athenians gave extraordinary power to a single man, Solon, a respected statesman, and asked him to reform their laws. Solon's reforms were sweeping. He canceled existing debts and outlawed the practice of using one's own body as collateral for loans, freeing many Athenians from debt slavery. He reorganized Athenian society into classes based on wealth rather than birth alone, opening up political participation, at least to some degree, to wealthy commoners who had previously been excluded simply because they weren't born into the right families. He also established that ordinary citizens could participate in an assembly and serve on juries, ideas that, while still far from full democracy, planted seeds that would grow into something much larger. That growth accelerated dramatically under a leader named Cleisthenes, around 508 BCE, who is often credited as the true founder of Athenian democracy. Cleisthenes reorganized the citizen body of Athens into new groups that deliberately mixed people from different regions and backgrounds together, breaking up the old power structures based on aristocratic family loyalty and local clan ties. He established the assembly, a gathering open to all male citizens, regardless of wealth, where major decisions, including whether to go to war, were debated and voted on directly, not by representatives, but by the citizens themselves, gathered together in person. He also helped establish the Council of 500, whose members were chosen by lottery rather than election, a detail that might sound strange to modern ears, but which reflected a very Greek idea that allowing wealthy or charismatic individuals to simply campaign their way into power created opportunities for corruption and manipulation, whereas random selection from the citizen body gave ordinary people a genuine chance to participate in governing their own city. It's important to be honest about the limits of Athenian democracy as well. The term democracy itself comes from two Greek words, demos, meaning the people, and kratos, meaning power or rule, so democracy literally means rule by the people. But in Athens, the people who could participate were a relatively narrow group, free adult male citizens whose fathers were also citizens. Women, regardless of their wealth or status, could not vote, hold office, or participate in the assembly. Enslaved people, who made up a significant portion of the population and whose labor was essential to the Athenian economy, had no political rights whatsoever. And foreigners living in Athens, even those who had lived there for generations, were excluded as well. So when we talk about Athenian democracy as a groundbreaking achievement, and it absolutely was, we also need to understand that it was a democracy with very narrow boundaries, a system that gave an unprecedented degree of direct political power to a relatively small group of men, while excluding the majority of the actual population living within the city. Within this system, however, the degree of direct participation was genuinely remarkable. Citizens didn't just vote occasionally. They were expected to actively participate in governing their city, attending assembly meetings, serving on juries that could include hundreds of citizens for a single trial, and potentially being selected by lottery to serve in various administrative roles for a year at a time. This created a political culture unlike almost anything that had existed before, one where ordinary craftsmen, farmers, and shopkeepers might find themselves, in any given year, helping to decide matters of war, law, and public policy that affected the entire city. Sparta, meanwhile, located in the region of Laconia in the southern Peloponnese, developed a society that was, in almost every respect, the mirror opposite of Athens. Where Athens valued debate, rhetoric, art, and intellectual achievement, Sparta valued discipline, military training, and conformity above almost everything else. Spartan society was built around a population called the Helots, a subjugated people, descendants of populations Sparta had conquered, who vastly outnumbered the Spartans themselves and who were forced to work the land as a kind of state-owned serf class, freeing Spartan citizens from the need to farm so they could dedicate their entire lives to military training. This arrangement, a small ruling class permanently outnumbered by an oppressed population they feared might rebel, shaped almost every aspect of Spartan life. From a very young age, Spartan boys were taken from their families and enrolled in a brutal state-run education and training system known as the Agoi, designed to produce soldiers who were tough, obedient, and utterly devoted to Sparta above their own individual identities or even their own families. They were deliberately underfed, encouraged to steal food as a way of teaching resourcefulness, and subjected to physical punishment and competition designed to harden them for a lifetime of military service. Spartan men remained part of the military system for most of their adult lives, living communally with their fellow soldiers even after marriage. Spartan women, interestingly, had a degree of independence and physical education that was almost unheard of elsewhere in Greece, including in Athens. Spartan girls also received physical training, wrestling, running, and other exercises based on the belief that strong mothers produced strong sons, and Spartan women managed household affairs and property with a degree of autonomy that shocked other Greeks, some of whom found Spartan women scandalously outspoken and independent compared to the more secluded lives that women in cities like Athens typically led. Sparta's government was also unusual, combining elements that on paper look almost contradictory. It had two kings ruling simultaneously from two different royal families, a system that may have originated from the merger of two earlier communities. It had an assembly of citizens, similar in some ways to Athens, though with far less actual power. And it had a council of elders, along with a uniquely Spartan institution, a group of 5 officials called ephors, elected annually, who held enormous power, including the ability to oversee the kings themselves, put them on trial, and even, in extreme cases, have them executed. This combination of kings, councils, and elected overseers created a system of checks and balances that, while very different from Athenian democracy, was specifically designed to prevent any single individual from accumulating too much personal power, a concern that, in different ways, runs through the political systems of nearly every major Greek city-state. Beyond Athens and Sparta, other city-states played crucial roles in shaping Greek history. Corinth, strategically located on the narrow isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to the rest of Greece, became one of the wealthiest and most commercially important cities in Greece. Controlling trade routes between the eastern and western Mediterranean, and famous for its pottery, its participation in early Greek colonization, and later for the engineering ambition, never fully realized in ancient times, of cutting a canal across the isthmus itself to allow ships to pass between two seas without the dangerous journey around the southern tip of the Peloponnese. Thebes, located in the region of Boeotia, north of Athens, was steeped in mythology, said to be the city founded by Cadmus, a hero connected to the alphabet itself, according to legend, and the setting for some of the most famous Greek tragedies, including the story of Oedipus, a king who unknowingly fulfills a terrible prophecy by killing his own father and marrying his own mother. A story that would later give psychology one of its most famous terms, and that explores with devastating power the Greek obsession with fate, prophecy, and the limits of human knowledge and control. Daily life across these city-states, despite their political differences, shared many common features. Most Greeks were farmers, growing grain, olives, and grapes, the foundation of the Mediterranean diet that has remained remarkably consistent for thousands of years. Olive oil was used not just for cooking, but for lighting lamps, for cleaning the body in place of soap, and as a valuable trade good. Wine, often diluted with water, was a staple drink, consumed at meals and especially at symposia, social gatherings where men reclined on couches, drank, discussed philosophy, politics, and poetry, and were sometimes entertained by musicians or performers, a practice that gives us a glimpse into the intellectual and social life of the citizen class beyond the formal world of the assembly or the battlefield. Religion permeated daily life in ways that went far beyond what we might think of as religious practice today. Sacrifices to the gods, public festivals honoring particular deities, household shrines dedicated to protective spirits, and consultations with oracles before major decisions were all woven into the fabric of ordinary life. Education, particularly for boys from citizen families, focused heavily on physical training, music, and the memorization of poetry, especially Homer, whose epics were considered not just entertainment, but a kind of moral and cultural education, full of examples of how to behave, how to think about honor, courage, and the relationship between humans and gods. And running through all of this, in every city-state, regardless of its government or its rivalries with its neighbors, was an intense culture of competition, in athletics, in poetry, in rhetoric, in warfare, and in the arts. The Greeks had a concept they called arete, often translated as excellence or virtue, but really meaning something closer to the fullest realization of one's potential, whether as a warrior, an athlete, a craftsman, or a citizen. This competitive drive toward excellence would soon be tested on a scale far beyond anything the Greek world had experienced before, when an enormous empire from the east, the largest the world had ever seen, set its sights on conquering the small, fractious, quarreling city-states of Greece. Before we cross over into the story of the Persian Wars, it's worth understanding exactly how Greek armies fought, because the style of warfare the Greeks developed says a great deal about their values, their society, and ultimately, how a collection of small, divided city-states managed to repel the might of the largest empire on earth. The core of almost every Greek army was the hoplite, a heavily armed infantry soldier, typically a citizen who provided his own equipment, a large round shield called a hoplon, from which the hoplite took his name, a bronze helmet, often topped with a crest, body armor made of bronze or layered linen, greaves to protect the shins, and a long spear as his primary weapon, with a short sword as backup. Because hoplites had to supply their own equipment, which was expensive, hoplite warfare was, in a sense, the warfare of the middle and upper classes of citizens, the same men who, in cities like Athens, were also voting in the assembly. This created an important link between military service and political participation that runs through much of Greek history. The idea that the men who fought for the city were also the men who governed it. Hoplites fought in a formation called the phalanx, a tightly packed rectangular formation, often 8 ranks deep, where each soldier's shield protected not only himself, but also part of the soldier standing to his left. This meant that the effectiveness of the entire formation depended on every individual maintaining his position, trusting the man beside him, and not breaking ranks, even when terrified. A phalanx that held together was almost unstoppable in a head-on collision with another formation, but a phalanx that broke, with gaps opening up and soldiers exposed on their unshielded sides, could collapse very quickly into a rout. This style of fighting placed enormous value on discipline, cohesion, and collective courage, the willingness of ordinary citizens to stand shoulder to shoulder with their neighbors and hold the line, rather than on individual heroics of the kind celebrated in the world of Achilles and Hector centuries earlier. In many ways, the phalanx reflected the values of the polis itself, individual identity subordinated to the good of the collective, at least on the battlefield. This was the kind of military system that Greece possessed when, in the late 6th century BCE, it found itself facing the Persian Empire, an empire that, at its height, stretched from the borders of India to the shores of the Aegean, encompassing dozens of different peoples, languages, and cultures, ruled by a king who held a title that translates roughly as King of Kings. From the Persian perspective, the Greek city-states on the western edge of their empire, particularly the Greek cities along the coast of Anatolia, in a region called Ionia, were simply another set of territories to be governed, smaller and less significant than many of the other regions under Persian control. But in 499 BCE, the Ionian Greek cities revolted against Persian rule, and Athens, along with another city, sent ships to help them, a decision that, while the revolt itself was eventually crushed, gave the Persian king Darius a reason to remember Athens specifically, and to consider it a troublesome city that needed to be dealt with. In 490 BCE, Darius sent a Persian force across the Aegean, landing on a plain called Marathon, not far from Athens, intending to punish the city and likely to install a friendlier government. The Athenians, facing a Persian force on their own soil, sent for help from Sparta, which, according to tradition, agreed to come, but could not arrive in time due to a religious festival they were unwilling to interrupt. So the Athenians, joined by a small force from the nearby city of Plataea, faced the Persians essentially alone, vastly outnumbered according to ancient sources, though modern historians debate the exact figures. What followed at the Battle of Marathon became one of the most celebrated military victories in Greek history. The Athenian general Miltiades arranged his forces in an unusual formation, thinning out the center of his line while strengthening the flanks or wings of his army. When the battle began, the Persian center, facing a weaker than expected Athenian center, pushed forward and broke through, but the strengthened Athenian wings on either side crushed the Persian flanks, then turned inward, surrounding the Persian center that had advanced too far. The result was a decisive Athenian victory, with the Persian forces driven back to their ships in disarray. The aftermath of Marathon gave rise to one of the most enduring legends in Greek history, the story of a runner, sometimes named Pheidippides, who supposedly ran the distance from the battlefield at Marathon to Athens, a distance of roughly 26 miles, to deliver news of the victory, collapsing and dying immediately after delivering his message. While historians debate the historical accuracy of this specific story, it has become permanently embedded in modern culture, giving us the name of the marathon race itself, a distance runners around the world still cover today, often without realizing they're commemorating, however loosely, an event from a battlefield near Athens nearly 2,500 years ago. Marathon was a significant Athenian victory, but it was not the end of the conflict with Persia. 10 years later, in 480 BCE, Darius's son and successor, Xerxes, launched a far larger invasion, assembling, according to ancient sources, an enormous army and navy, numbers that ancient historians like Herodotus reported in the hundreds of thousands. Though modern scholars generally believe these figures were significantly exaggerated, while still representing a force vastly larger than anything the Greek city-states, even acting together, could match in raw numbers. Faced with this overwhelming threat, a coalition of Greek city-states, led primarily by Sparta and Athens, an alliance remarkable in itself given how often these cities were rivals, attempted to coordinate a defense. One of the most famous moments of this entire war took place at a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, where a relatively small Greek force, famously including 300 Spartans under their king Leonidas, along with several thousand other Greek soldiers from various city-states, attempted to hold the pass against the entire Persian army, using the narrow terrain to prevent the Persians from being able to bring their numerical advantage fully to bear. For 2 days, the Greek defenders held the pass, inflicting significant losses on the Persian forces in the tight confines where Persian numbers mattered less than discipline and the length of Greek spears. But on the 3rd day, a local resident, according to Herodotus, revealed to the Persians the existence of a mountain path that allowed a Persian force to outflank the Greek position, threatening to surround the defenders entirely. Most of the Greek forces retreated upon learning of this, but Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, along with a small number of other soldiers who chose to remain, stayed to fight a rearguard action. Knowing they faced certain death, buying time for the rest of the Greek forces to escape and regroup, they were eventually surrounded and killed, to the last man. From a purely military standpoint, Thermopylae was a Persian victory. The pass was taken, and the Persian army continued its advance into Greece, eventually reaching and burning Athens itself, whose population had been evacuated. But the story of Thermopylae took on a meaning that went far beyond its immediate military outcome. It became, almost immediately, a symbol, a story about the willingness of free citizens to die rather than submit to an empire, about discipline and sacrifice in defense of something larger than oneself. And that symbolic power has only grown over the centuries, with Thermopylae remaining, even today, one of the most referenced battles in all of military history, invoked whenever people want to describe a small force making a heroic last stand against overwhelming odds. While the land battle at Thermopylae was unfolding, a parallel naval battle was taking place nearby, and it was at sea, not on land, that the war would ultimately be decided. The Athenians, in the years leading up to this invasion, had made a crucial decision, under the leadership of a statesman named Themistocles, to invest heavily in building a large fleet of triremes, fast, maneuverable warships powered by rows of oarsmen, originally justified partly as a defense against a rival city, but which would prove decisive against Persia. After Athens itself fell and was burned, the Greek fleet, including a large contingent of Athenian ships, gathered in the narrow straits near the island of Salamis, close to Athens. Themistocles, through a combination of strategy and what ancient sources describe as deliberate deception, managed to lure the much larger Persian fleet into these narrow waters, where the sheer size of the Persian fleet became a disadvantage rather than an advantage, with ships unable to maneuver effectively in the confined space, crowding into each other while the smaller, more agile Greek ships attacked with devastating effect. The Battle of Salamis resulted in a catastrophic defeat for the Persian navy, and Xerxes himself, according to tradition, watched the disaster unfold from a hillside overlooking the strait. Salamis was the turning point of the entire war. With his navy destroyed, Xerxes withdrew much of his army back toward Persia, leaving a smaller force in Greece, which was decisively defeated the following year at the Battle of Plataea, a land battle in which Spartan-led forces played the central role, finally driving Persian forces out of mainland Greece for good. The significance of the Persian Wars for Greek history and for world history is difficult to overstate. A loose coalition of small, often quarreling city-states had successfully defended themselves against the largest empire the world had ever known, an empire with vastly greater resources, population, and wealth. This victory created an enormous surge of confidence, particularly in Athens, which emerged from the war with enhanced prestige, a powerful navy, and a growing sense of itself as the leader and protector of the Greek world. That confidence, that sense of having achieved something extraordinary against overwhelming odds, would help fuel one of the most remarkable bursts of cultural, artistic, and intellectual achievement in human history, a period we now call the Golden Age of Athens. In the decades following the Persian Wars, Athens transformed itself from a city that had been burned to the ground into the wealthiest, most powerful, and most culturally influential city in the Greek world. And at the center of this transformation was a statesman named Pericles, who dominated Athenian politics for roughly 3 decades and whose name has become almost synonymous with this entire era, often simply called the Age of Pericles. Much of Athens' wealth and influence during this period came from its leadership of an alliance of Greek city-states originally formed to continue resisting Persia, an alliance that historians call the Delian League, named for the island of Delos, where its treasury was originally kept. Over time, what began as a voluntary alliance of equals increasingly came to resemble an Athenian empire, with member states paying tribute, ostensibly for continued defense against Persia, but increasingly used by Athens for its own purposes, including, most famously, funding an enormous building program in Athens itself, a program that would produce some of the most iconic structures in the history of architecture. The centerpiece of this building program was the Parthenon, a massive temple dedicated to Athena, built on top of the Acropolis, the rocky hill at the heart of Athens that had served as a fortified stronghold since Mycenaean times. The Parthenon was constructed primarily of marble, using a design that, while appearing perfectly regular and symmetrical at first glance, actually incorporated subtle curves and adjustments. Columns that lean slightly inward, a floor that curves gently upward toward the center, refinements that corrected for optical illusions and made the building appear even more perfectly proportioned to the human eye than a truly rectilinear structure would have. Inside the Parthenon stood a massive statue of Athena, created by the sculptor Phidias, covered in gold and ivory, a statue so famous in antiquity that, although it has long since been lost, ancient descriptions of it have allowed historians and artists to reconstruct its likely appearance. The Parthenon was just one part of a larger complex on the Acropolis that included other temples and gateways, all built with extraordinary attention to detail, employing some of the finest sculptors, architects, and craftsmen in the Greek world. This building program served multiple purposes at once. It honored the gods, particularly Athena, the patron deity of Athens. It demonstrated Athenian wealth and power to the rest of Greece and to foreign visitors, and it provided employment for a huge number of skilled and unskilled workers, an early example of how large public works projects could serve both ideological and economic functions simultaneously. But the Golden Age of Athens was about far more than architecture. This period saw an explosion of intellectual activity that would shape the trajectory of Western thought for thousands of years, beginning with a revolution in how people thought about knowledge itself. A revolution we associate above all with 3 figures, whose names remain instantly recognizable today: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates, who lived through much of the 5th century BCE, never wrote down any of his own teachings, and everything we know about him comes from the writings of his students and contemporaries, which means that separating the historical Socrates from the way he was later portrayed is genuinely difficult. What we can say is that Socrates developed and popularized a method of inquiry that has come to be called the Socratic method, a way of pursuing truth not by lecturing or asserting answers, but by asking a series of probing questions, often about concepts that people assumed they understood perfectly well, like justice, courage, or piety, and gradually revealing, through careful questioning, that the person being questioned didn't actually understand these concepts as clearly as they thought they did. This might sound like a fairly gentle intellectual exercise, but in practice, Socrates' relentless questioning often embarrassed prominent and powerful Athenians, exposing the gaps and contradictions in their thinking in front of an audience. And this, combined with the political turmoil Athens experienced toward the end of the 5th century BCE, eventually led to Socrates being put on trial, charged with corrupting the youth of Athens and failing to recognize the gods the city recognized. Found guilty by an Athenian jury, Socrates was sentenced to death, and rather than attempting to escape, which his friends apparently offered to help arrange, Socrates accepted the sentence. drinking a cup of poison hemlock surrounded by his students, an event that became one of the most famous deaths in the history of philosophy, often interpreted as a powerful statement about the importance of living and dying according to one's principles, even when the society around you gets it wrong. One of those students, Plato, would go on to become one of the most influential philosophers in human history, founding a school in Athens called the Academy, a name that, through an unbroken chain of cultural influence, gives us our modern word academic. Plato wrote extensively, often in the form of dialogues featuring Socrates as the main speaker, making it genuinely difficult to know where Socrates' actual ideas end and Plato's own ideas, put into Socrates' mouth, begin. Among Plato's most influential ideas was his theory of forms, the notion that the physical world we perceive with our senses is, in a sense, just a shadow or imperfect copy of a more real, eternal realm of perfect, unchanging ideas, or forms, an idea Plato illustrated with his famous allegory of the cave, in which people chained inside a cave their entire lives mistake shadows on a wall for reality itself, never realizing that a richer, truer world exists outside, an image that has influenced philosophy, religion, and even popular films for over 2,000 years. Plato's own student, Aristotle, took Greek philosophy in a different direction, one grounded much more firmly in observation of the actual physical world. Aristotle's interests were almost unimaginably broad. He wrote about logic, biology, physics, ethics, politics, poetry, and rhetoric, essentially attempting to systematically organize and explain nearly every field of human knowledge that existed at the time. His work on logic established formal rules for valid reasoning that would remain the foundation of logical thought in the Western world for nearly 2,000 years. His biological observations, based on careful study of animals, demonstrated an empirical, evidence-based approach to understanding the natural world that anticipates, in important ways, the methods of modern science. And later in his life, Aristotle would become the tutor of a young Macedonian prince, a connection that would tie the world of Greek philosophy directly to one of the most consequential figures in all of ancient history, Alexander the Great, whose story we'll return to soon. This period also saw remarkable developments in science and mathematics more broadly. While many of the most famous mathematical figures, like Euclid, whose work on geometry would remain the standard textbook on the subject for over 2,000 years, and Archimedes, whose discoveries in mathematics, physics, and engineering ranged from principles of buoyancy to ingenious war machines, belong to a slightly later period than the Golden Age of Athens itself. The intellectual culture that produced them was deeply rooted in this era's embrace of rational inquiry, the idea that the natural world operates according to principles that can be discovered through careful observation and logical reasoning, rather than simply attributed to the unpredictable whims of the gods. This didn't mean the Greeks abandoned religion, far from it, but it did mean that, alongside their religious beliefs, an increasingly confident tradition of natural philosophy, the ancestor of what we now call science, was taking root, asking questions about the fundamental nature of matter, the movements of celestial bodies, and the causes of natural phenomena like earthquakes and eclipses. Perhaps nowhere was the intellectual and cultural energy of this period more vividly expressed than in Greek theater, which had developed out of religious festivals honoring Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstatic experience we encountered earlier. These festivals featured competitions between playwrights, whose works were performed in massive open-air theaters, carved into hillsides, with acoustics so effective that even a whisper on stage could reportedly be heard by audience members seated far away at the top of the theater, a testament to the sophisticated understanding of sound and architecture the Greeks had developed. Greek tragedy, the dominant form in these competitions, typically dealt with stories drawn from mythology, often the same myths we've already explored, the houses of Agamemnon and Oedipus, the wars and curses that plagued legendary families for generations, but reimagined in ways that explored timeless human questions about fate, justice, guilt, and the relationship between humans and the gods. The playwright Aeschylus wrote a trilogy following the story of Agamemnon's return from Troy, his murder by his wife Clytemnestra in revenge for the sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia, and the subsequent cycle of revenge that follows, ultimately exploring how a society moves from a cycle of personal vengeance toward a system of formal justice and trial, a theme with obvious resonance for a city that had recently developed its own elaborate legal and jury systems. Sophocles wrote the story of Oedipus, a king who, despite his intelligence and good intentions, cannot escape a prophecy made before his birth, a story that raises profound questions about free will, knowledge, and the limits of human control over our own destinies. Euripides, often considered the most psychologically complex of the great tragedians, wrote plays that frequently sympathized with characters who might otherwise be considered villains or outsiders, women, foreigners, and victims of war, often presenting deeply uncomfortable critiques of Athenian society and its wars, even while those very wars were ongoing. Alongside tragedy, Greek comedy developed its own distinct tradition, most famously associated with the playwright Aristophanes, whose plays were often wildly inventive, satirical, and politically pointed, mocking prominent politicians, philosophers, including Socrates himself, and even the gods, with a freedom of expression that, in many other societies throughout history, would have been unthinkable. One of Aristophanes' plays imagines the women of Athens and Sparta going on a sex strike to force their husbands to end a war, a premise that is both wildly comedic and, underneath the humor, a genuine commentary on the human costs of constant warfare. This entire flowering of philosophy, art, architecture, science, and theater did not happen in a political vacuum, and in fact, much of it occurred during a period of escalating tension and eventually outright war between Athens and Sparta, a conflict that would test, and in many ways shatter, the confidence and unity that had followed the victory over Persia, plunging the Greek world into decades of warfare that would leave it weakened and vulnerable, just as a new power was beginning to rise in the north. Before we follow Greece into the long, exhausting war that would consume the second half of the 5th century BCE, it's worth stepping back into mythology one more time, because the heroes of Greek legend, figures whose stories were told and retold throughout this entire period, in poetry, in painted pottery, in sculpture, and on the stage, reveal something essential about how the Greeks understood courage, cleverness, and the strange, often uncomfortable relationship between mortals and the gods who toyed with their lives. No hero looms larger in Greek mythology than Heracles, known to the Romans as Hercules, a son of Zeus whose very existence was a product of one of Zeus's countless affairs, and who, as a result, became the target of Hera's relentless hatred from the moment he was born. As an infant, Hera sent 2 serpents to kill Heracles in his crib, but the baby strangled them both with his bare hands, an early sign of the superhuman strength that would define his entire life. Later, in a fit of madness inflicted on him by Hera, Heracles killed his own wife and children, a horrifying act for which he sought purification and was sentenced to perform a series of seemingly impossible tasks which have come down to us as the 12 labors of Heracles. These labors included killing the Nemean lion, a beast whose hide was so tough that ordinary weapons couldn't pierce it, forcing Heracles to strangle it with his bare hands and then use its own claws to skin it, after which he wore the lion's pelt as armor for the rest of his life, becoming one of his most recognizable attributes in Greek art. We've already discussed 2 other labors, defeating the multi-headed Hydra and capturing Cerberus from the underworld. Other labors involved capturing a sacred deer with golden antlers without harming it, cleaning out the enormous filth-filled stables of King Augeas in a single day by diverting 2 rivers to wash through them. An early and almost comically practical example of engineering as a solution to a mythological problem, and traveling to the edges of the known world to retrieve golden apples from a garden guarded by a 100-headed dragon, apples that belong to the Hesperides, nymphs of the evening. What makes Heracles such an enduring figure isn't just his strength, but the way his story combines almost superhuman power with deeply human flaws, rage, grief, and guilt. Unlike many heroes who are born into royalty or destined for greatness from birth in obviously positive ways, Heracles' story is one of punishment and redemption, a being of immense power, forced to atone for terrible deeds, eventually earning a place among the gods on Olympus after his death, a rare honor for a mortal, even one who was the son of Zeus. Perseus, whose story we touched on briefly when discussing Medusa, was another son of Zeus, born to a mortal woman named Danae, after Zeus visited her in the form of a shower of golden light, a detail that has inspired countless works of art over the centuries. Sent on what was meant to be an impossible, fatal quest by a king who wanted him out of the way, Perseus was given help by several gods, winged sandals from Hermes that allowed him to fly, a mirrored shield from Athena that allowed him to look at Medusa's reflection rather than directly at her, avoiding her petrifying gaze, and a cap that granted invisibility. Using these gifts, Perseus succeeded in beheading Medusa while she slept, and on his journey home, he rescued a princess named Andromeda, who had been chained to a rock as a sacrifice to a sea monster, by turning the monster to stone with Medusa's severed head, a story that has been retold countless times throughout history, including in modern films. Theseus, the legendary founder hero of Athens itself, is most famous for his journey into the labyrinth on Crete to face the Minotaur, the story we touched on earlier. According to the myth, Theseus volunteered to be one of the young Athenians sent as tribute to Crete, determined to kill the Minotaur and end the cycle of sacrifice. On Crete, he was helped by Ariadne, daughter of King Minos, who fell in love with him and gave him a ball of thread, which Theseus unwound as he made his way through the labyrinth, allowing him to find his way back out after killing the Minotaur in single combat. The story doesn't end happily for everyone involved. However, Theseus later abandoned Ariadne on an island during the journey home, an act that later storytellers struggled to explain or justify, and reflects how Greek myths often resist simple, tidy moral lessons, leaving their heroes morally complicated even in their moments of triumph. Theseus's return to Athens also includes a tragic detail involving his father, Aegeus, who had asked Theseus to raise white sails on his ship if he survived, and black sails if he had died. Theseus, in the chaos of his departure, forgot to change the ship's black sails, and Aegeus, seeing the black sails approaching from a cliff overlooking the sea, assumed his son was dead and threw himself into the water in grief, a sea that, according to legend, was named the Aegean in his memory. Jason's story centers on his quest for the Golden Fleece, the hide of a magical ram with golden wool, kept in a distant kingdom and guarded by a dragon. To retrieve it, Jason assembled a crew of heroes, including, in many versions, Heracles himself, who sailed together on a ship called the Argo, giving this group of heroes their collective name, the Argonauts. The journey of the Argo took them through numerous dangers, including an encounter with the Harpies, vicious bird-like creatures, and a passage through the Symplegades, a pair of massive rocks that crashed together to crush any ship attempting to pass between them, a hazard the Argonauts survived through careful timing and divine assistance. Jason eventually succeeded in obtaining the Golden Fleece, largely with the help of Medea, a powerful sorceress and princess of the kingdom where the fleece was kept, who fell in love with Jason and used her magical knowledge to help him complete tasks that would otherwise have been impossible. Medea's story, like Ariadne's, ends in tragedy and betrayal. Jason later abandons her for another marriage, and Medea, in one of the most disturbing and powerful stories in all of Greek tragedy, takes a horrifying revenge, a story that Euripides turned into one of the most psychologically intense plays to survive from ancient Greece, exploring themes of betrayal, rage, and the devastating consequences of breaking sacred promises. Bellerophon, another hero whose story involves a winged creature, is best known for taming and riding Pegasus, the winged horse that sprang from the blood of Medusa when Perseus beheaded her. With Pegasus, Bellerophon was able to defeat the Chimera, a fire-breathing monster with the body of a lion, a goat's head emerging from its back, and a serpent for a tail, by flying above it and attacking from the air, where the creature's deadly breath and claws couldn't reach him. Another example of cleverness and the use of unexpected advantages overcoming a seemingly unbeatable foe. Atalanta stands out among Greek heroes as one of the few prominent female figures whose story revolves around physical skill and competition rather than romance or tragedy alone, though those elements appear too. Raised in the wilderness and devoted to the goddess Artemis, Atalanta was an extraordinarily fast runner and skilled hunter who participated in the hunt for the Caledonian boar, a massive monster terrorizing a kingdom, alongside many of the most famous heroes in Greek mythology, and who was, according to some versions, the first to wound the beast. Atalanta also famously declared that she would only marry a man who could defeat her in a foot race, a challenge that many suitors attempted and lost, often with fatal consequences, until one suitor, with help from Aphrodite, used golden apples to distract Atalanta during the race, dropping them so that her curiosity and desire to retrieve them slowed her down just enough for him to win, a story that, again, reflects the recurring Greek fascination with cleverness and divine intervention triumphing over raw physical superiority. Running through nearly all of these hero stories is a theme we've mentioned several times, but haven't fully explored: the relationship between fate, prophecy, and free will, a tension that the Greeks took extremely seriously, and that was embodied, above all, in the great oracles of the Greek world, the most famous of which was located at Delphi, a site considered so sacred that the Greeks believed it marked the very center of the earth, a stone called the omphalos, or navel, marking this spot. At Delphi, a priestess known as the Pythia, seated on a tripod above a chasm in the earth, from which, according to ancient accounts, intoxicating vapors rose, would enter a trance-like state and deliver prophecies, speaking on behalf of the god Apollo, prophecies that were often deliberately ambiguous, open to multiple interpretations, a feature that, whether by design or by the nature of how oracles worked, meant that the oracle was rarely, in hindsight, simply wrong, even when the person receiving the prophecy badly misunderstood its meaning. The most famous example of this involves a wealthy king named Croesus, who, before going to war with Persia, asked the oracle at Delphi what would happen if he attacked, and was told that if he attacked Persia, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus, interpreting this as a guarantee of victory, attacked and was utterly defeated. The great empire destroyed turned out to be his own. This story illustrates something central to Greek thinking about fate and prophecy. The gods, and the oracles that spoke for them, could see the future, but mortals, even kings, often could not properly interpret what they were told, and attempting to act on prophecy without true understanding could lead directly to the very disaster one was trying to avoid. This is exactly the trap that catches Oedipus, whose entire tragic story unfolds because his parents, upon hearing a prophecy that their son would kill his father and marry his mother, try to prevent this fate by abandoning the infant Oedipus to die, an attempt that, through a chain of events neither they nor Oedipus could foresee, ends up creating the exact circumstances needed for the prophecy to come true anyway. The Greeks generally did not believe that knowing the future allowed you to escape it. If anything, attempting to escape fate was often the very mechanism by which fate caught up with you, a deeply unsettling idea, but one that gave their tragedies an almost unbearable sense of dramatic inevitability. Audiences watching these plays already knew how the story would end, and the tension came not from wondering what would happen, but from watching characters walk, often with the best intentions, directly toward catastrophes the audience could see coming, but the characters could not. And yet, alongside this seemingly bleak view of fate, Greek heroes were also celebrated, again and again, for their choices, their courage, their cleverness, their willingness to act, even in the face of overwhelming odds or prophesied doom. Achilles chooses to return to battle, knowing it will lead to his own death. Leonidas chooses to stay at Thermopylae knowing he will not survive. Heracles chooses to atone for his crimes through labor rather than despair. This apparent contradiction, a universe governed by fate, yet filled with heroes whose choices and character clearly matter, was not something the Greeks resolved with a single tidy answer, and in many ways, that unresolved tension is exactly what kept their stories alive, generation after generation, as each new audience wrestled with the same impossible question: how much of our lives do we really control? And how much is simply, inevitably, going to happen anyway? The same Athens that produced Socrates, the Parthenon, and the great tragedians was also, by the second half of the 5th century BCE, an increasingly assertive imperial power, and its growing dominance over the Aegean world made other Greek states, particularly Sparta and its allies, deeply uneasy. The result was a long, devastating conflict that historians call the Peloponnesian War, fought intermittently for nearly 30 years, from 431 to 404 BCE, a war that would do more than any single event to end the Golden Age and reshape the balance of power across the Greek world. The underlying causes of the war were complex, but at their heart lay a fundamental imbalance that many Greek states found increasingly intolerable. Athens controlled a powerful navy and an alliance system that had effectively become an empire, collecting tribute from member states and using that wealth to fund its own ambitions, while Sparta led a separate alliance of mainland states, the Peloponnesian League, that included Corinth and other cities increasingly alarmed by Athenian expansion. Tensions had been simmering for years, with smaller conflicts and disputes between Athenian allies and Spartan allies repeatedly threatening to escalate into a larger war, until eventually a series of these disputes, combined with Corinthian pressure on Sparta to act, tipped the Greek world into full-scale conflict. The strategies adopted by the two sides in the early years of the war reflected their fundamentally different strengths. Sparta, with its formidable land army, repeatedly invaded Athenian territory, devastating farmland and putting pressure on the Athenian population. Athens, under the strategy devised by Pericles, largely avoided open battle with the Spartan army, instead retreating behind its city walls, which were connected by a fortified corridor to its port at Piraeus, allowing Athens to be supplied by sea even while its surrounding farmland was being ravaged. This strategy effectively turned Athens into an island, immune to Spartan land power as long as its navy controlled the sea and its supply lines remained open. This strategy might have worked, but it came with an unforeseen and devastating cost. Cramming a large rural population behind the city walls created the perfect conditions for the spread of disease, and early in the war, a catastrophic plague swept through Athens, killing a huge portion of the population, including, eventually, Pericles himself. The Athenian historian Thucydides, who lived through the plague and wrote one of the most important historical accounts to survive from the ancient world, described its symptoms and its effects on Athenian society in vivid detail, including how the scale of death led to a breakdown in normal social and religious customs, with people, faced with the apparent randomness of who lived and who died, increasingly abandoning traditional restraints in favor of seeking immediate pleasure, since, as Thucydides put it, no one expected to live long enough for either reward or punishment to matter. With Pericles dead, Athenian leadership became less cautious and more aggressive, and the war saw a series of dramatic shifts in fortune. One of the most significant turning points came when Athens, despite ongoing conflict with Sparta closer to home, launched an enormous and ambitious expedition to Sicily, hoping to conquer the wealthy city of Syracuse and dramatically expand Athenian power in the western Mediterranean. This expedition, the Sicilian expedition, turned into one of the greatest military disasters in Greek history. The Athenian fleet and army were ultimately destroyed, with thousands of soldiers killed or captured, a catastrophic loss of manpower and resources from which Athens never fully recovered. The war dragged on for years after the Sicilian disaster, with Sparta, significantly, eventually building its own navy with financial support from Persia, the very empire that Athens and Sparta had once united to repel, a stark illustration of how desperation and rivalry could override even the deepest historical animosities. Eventually, in 404 BCE, with its navy destroyed and its population starving under siege, Athens surrendered. The terms imposed on the defeated city were harsh. Athens was forced to tear down its fortifications, surrender most of its remaining fleet, and accept the installation of a Spartan-backed government, a brief and brutal oligarchy known to history as the 30 Tyrants, whose rule was so violent and unpopular that it was overthrown within a year, with Athenian democracy eventually restored, though the city would never again hold the dominant position it had occupied before the war. The Peloponnesian War left the entire Greek world exhausted, weakened, and deeply divided. Sparta, the nominal victor, found itself unable to maintain the kind of dominance over Greece that Athens had once held, and within just a few decades, Sparta itself would be challenged and decisively defeated by other Greek powers, including Thebes, in battles that demonstrated new tactical innovations in how the traditional phalanx could be deployed and defeated. The decades following the Peloponnesian War were marked by a shifting, unstable pattern of alliances and conflicts between Athens, Sparta, Thebes, and other city-states, none of which could establish lasting dominance over the others. A pattern of mutual exhaustion that left the Greek world, for all its cultural brilliance, politically fragmented and militarily weakened at precisely the moment when a new power, watching from just beyond the northern borders of the traditional Greek world, was beginning to grow into something that would change the course of history forever. To the north of the traditional Greek heartland lay Macedon, a kingdom that most southern Greeks had long regarded as semi-barbaric, culturally Greek in some respects. Its ruling family even claimed descent from Heracles, but politically and socially very different from the city-states of the south, organized as a monarchy rather than the various forms of republics, oligarchies, and democracies found further south, and generally excluded from the most prestigious Greek institutions and competitions. That perception of Macedon as a backwater changed dramatically under a king named Philip II, who came to power in 359 BCE and proceeded to transform Macedon into the most powerful military force in the Greek world within a remarkably short span of time. Philip's military reforms were genuinely revolutionary. He reorganized the Macedonian army around an improved version of the phalanx, equipped with an extraordinarily long spear called the sarissa, far longer than the spears used by traditional Greek hoplites, which allowed Macedonian infantry to strike enemy soldiers before those soldiers could even reach them with their own weapons. He also developed and refined the use of cavalry as a decisive offensive force, working in close coordination with infantry in ways that most Greek armies, which had traditionally relied much more heavily on infantry alone, had never fully developed. Philip also proved to be a shrewd diplomat, skillfully exploiting the divisions between the various Greek city-states, forming alliances, intervening in disputes, and gradually extending Macedonian influence southward into Greece itself, often through diplomacy and bribery as much as through outright warfare. The southern Greek states, particularly Athens and Thebes, eventually recognized the threat Philip posed and formed an alliance to oppose him, but in 338 BCE, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip's forces decisively defeated this combined Greek army, effectively ending the independence of the Greek city-states as meaningful, autonomous political powers. Philip then organized the Greek states into a league under his leadership, ostensibly for a unified purpose, a war against Persia, the old enemy from the Persian Wars over a century earlier, framed now as a kind of pan-Hellenic crusade. But before Philip could lead this invasion, he was assassinated in 336 BCE under circumstances that remain debated by historians, leaving the throne and the planned invasion of Persia to his 20-year-old son. That son was Alexander, who would go on to be known to history as Alexander the Great, and whose conquests over the following 13 years would create one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen. Stretching from Greece to Egypt to the borders of India, Alexander had been educated by Aristotle himself, brought to the Macedonian court specifically to tutor the young prince, a connection that gives us one of history's most remarkable juxtapositions. The philosopher who systematically organized human knowledge, teaching the young man who would spread Greek culture across the largest empire the world had yet seen. Alexander's military campaign began with the invasion of the Persian Empire, the same empire that, generations earlier, had been repelled at Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis, but which had, since then, remained the dominant power of the ancient Near East. Alexander's army, though significantly smaller than the forces the Persian king Darius III could theoretically muster, proved repeatedly superior in battle, winning decisive victories that opened the way first into Anatolia, then into the Levant and Egypt, where Alexander was reportedly welcomed as a liberator and even, according to Egyptian religious tradition, recognized as a divine pharaoh, and founded the city of Alexandria, which would go on to become one of the great intellectual centers of the ancient world for centuries. Alexander then turned east into the heart of the Persian Empire itself, winning further decisive victories and eventually capturing the great Persian capitals, effectively ending the Persian Empire as a political entity. An empire that had stood for over 2 centuries, brought down within just a few years by an army from a kingdom that, within living memory, had been considered a marginal player in Greek affairs. But Alexander did not stop at the borders of the former Persian Empire. He continued eastward, into Central Asia and eventually into India, fighting battles against local rulers and their forces, including war elephants, a weapon Greek and Macedonian soldiers had never encountered before. It was only when his exhausted army, after years of continuous campaigning far from home, refused to march further east, that Alexander finally turned back, and he died in 323 BCE in Babylon, at the age of just 32. Having never lost a major battle, and having created an empire so vast that no single ruler could realistically hold it together. And indeed, almost immediately after Alexander's death, his empire began to fracture, divided among his generals, in a series of conflicts that historians call the Wars of the Successors, eventually settling into several major kingdoms, including the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, founded by one of Alexander's generals and ruled by his descendants for centuries. The Seleucid kingdom covering much of the former Persian heartland and parts of the Near East, and the Antigonid kingdom in Macedon and Greece itself. This period, from Alexander's death until the eventual Roman conquest of these kingdoms, is what historians call the Hellenistic period, and it represents, in many ways, the final great chapter of ancient Greek civilization, the one that looked very different from the world of independent city-states that had come before. During the Hellenistic period, Greek language, art, architecture, and ideas spread across an enormous geographic area, from the Western Mediterranean to Central Asia, blending with local cultures in ways that produced fascinating hybrid forms, Greek-style sculptures of local deities in Egypt and the Near East, Greek architectural elements appearing in cities thousands of miles from Greece itself, and Greek becoming a common language of trade, administration, and scholarship across this vast area. Much as English functions as a global lingua franca today, the city of Alexandria in particular became an extraordinary center of learning, home to a massive library that, according to ancient accounts, aimed to collect copies of every significant work of literature and scholarship that existed, and to a community of scholars who made major advances in fields ranging from mathematics and astronomy to medicine and geography, including calculations of the size of the Earth that were remarkably accurate given the tools available at the time. But even as Greek culture spread further than ever before, the political independence that had defined the classical Greek world, the world of fiercely autonomous city-states governing themselves, debating in their assemblies, and fighting their own wars, was effectively over. The Hellenistic kingdoms were monarchies, ruled by Greek and Macedonian dynasties, but governing populations that were overwhelmingly non-Greek, a very different political model from the polis. And looming on the horizon, growing steadily in power throughout this entire period, was a city that had begun as a relatively minor settlement in central Italy, but that was steadily expanding its control across the Italian peninsula and would, over the following centuries, come into increasing contact and eventually conflict with the Hellenistic kingdoms that had inherited Alexander's empire. That city, of course, was Rome, and its rise would mark the final transition of the ancient Mediterranean world from a Greek-dominated era to a Roman one, though, as we'll see, this transition would be far more complicated and in many ways far less of a true ending for Greek civilization than the word conquest might suggest. To understand how Rome's rise actually played out for the Greek world, though, we need to step back and look at something that had been running underneath everything we've talked about so far, something that touched every aspect of Greek life, from the grandest state ceremony to the smallest household routine, and that is Greek religion itself. Because for all the philosophy, all the rational inquiry into the nature of the universe that we explored with thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, the vast majority of Greeks across all classes and city-states continued to live in a world saturated with gods, spirits, omens, and ritual obligations, and the two systems, philosophical speculation and traditional worship, coexisted without most people seeing any contradiction between them. Religion in ancient Greece was not a separate sphere of life the way it often is in the modern world, something you do on a particular day of the week and otherwise set aside. It was woven into politics, into agriculture, into warfare, into family life, into the calendar itself, which was structured around religious festivals rather than the other way around. A Greek city-state without its patron deity and its associated rituals was almost unthinkable, because the relationship between a city and its gods was understood as a kind of contract, a reciprocal arrangement in which the city offered sacrifices, built temples, and held festivals, and in return the gods offered protection, prosperity, and favor in war. Break that arrangement, neglect the gods, and you risked plague, defeat, famine, all the disasters that ancient peoples across the Mediterranean attributed to divine displeasure. The temple was the physical center of this relationship, and it's worth pausing on what a Greek temple actually was, because it's easy to misunderstand based on how we encounter them today, as roofless ruins of weathered marble columns standing in fields or on hilltops. In their own time, Greek temples were not quiet, contemplative spaces where worshippers gathered to sit and pray, the way a church or mosque might function today. A Greek temple was, in essence, a house for a god, a building constructed to contain a cult statue, often a large and elaborately decorated image of the deity, and the temple's interior was typically off-limits to ordinary people except for priests and certain officials on specific occasions. The real religious activity, the sacrifices, the processions, the communal gatherings, happened outside, on the altar that stood in front of the temple, often quite a distance away, where the smoke from burnt offerings could rise up toward the heavens, and those temples were not the bare stone we see now. They were riotously colorful, painted in reds, blues, and golds, with elaborate sculptural decoration on the pediments and friezes depicting scenes from mythology. The very same myths we've spent so much time exploring, gods battling giants, heroes slaying monsters, all rendered in vivid color and displayed prominently for everyone in the city to see. The Parthenon, which we discussed earlier as an architectural marvel, was also a riot of color in its original state, with its frieze depicting a procession and its pediments showing the birth of Athena and her contest with Poseidon for patronage of the city, myth and civic identity fused together in stone and paint for all to behold. Sacrifice was the central act of Greek worship, and it's a practice that can seem alien or even disturbing to modern audiences, but it made complete sense within the Greek worldview. An animal, usually a goat, sheep, pig, or in grander ceremonies a bull, would be led to the altar in a procession, often accompanied by music and prayers, and then ritually killed. But here's the detail that often surprises people. The gods, in this arrangement, didn't actually get the meat. The bones, fat, and certain inedible parts were burned on the altar as the portion offered to the divine, the smoke carrying the offering up to Olympus, while the actual meat, the edible parts, were cooked and distributed among the human participants for a communal feast. There's actually a myth that explains this arrangement, one involving the trickster god Prometheus, the same figure who would later steal fire for humanity and suffer eternal punishment for it. According to the story, Prometheus was asked to divide a sacrificial animal between the gods and humans, and he famously tricked Zeus by presenting two piles, one that looked impressive on the outside, but contained only bones wrapped in glistening fat, and another that looked unappealing, but contained all the good meat. Zeus, the story goes, knowingly chose the bones anyway, but the arrangement stuck, which is why, in Greek religious practice, humans got to eat the meat from sacrifices while the gods received only smoke and bone. It's a wonderfully human myth, one that explains a religious practice while also slipping in a bit of dry humor about divine pride and human cunning, and it shows how thoroughly myth and ritual were intertwined, each one explaining and reinforcing the other. Beyond individual sacrifices, Greek religious life was structured around an extensive calendar of festivals, and these were not solemn, restrained affairs but often massive civic celebrations that could last for days and involve the entire population of a city. Athens alone had dozens of festivals throughout the year, but perhaps the grandest was the Panathenaia, held in honor of Athena, the city's patron goddess, featuring athletic competitions, musical contests, and a great procession that wound through the city up to the Acropolis, where a new robe, woven by specially selected women over the course of months, would be presented to the ancient statue of the goddess. Then there was the city Dionysia, the festival of Dionysus that we touched on briefly when discussing theater, which combined wild, ecstatic religious celebration, processions featuring enormous phallic symbols representing fertility, and the dramatic competitions that produced the tragedies and comedies we now study as the foundation of Western theater. And perhaps most mysterious of all were the Eleusinian Mysteries, held at the town of Eleusis near Athens, in honor of Demeter and her daughter Persephone, whose myth of abduction into the underworld and seasonal return we touched on earlier as an explanation for the cycle of seasons. The mysteries involved initiation rites so secret that participants were sworn under penalty of death never to reveal what happened inside the sanctuary, and to this day, despite thousands of people having undergone the initiation over more than 1,000 years, we still don't know exactly what occurred during the central ceremony. Only that participants emerged, describing a profound experience that gave them comfort about what awaited them after death. It's one of the great unsolved mysteries of the ancient world, a religious secret so well kept that even modern scholarship, with all its tools of archaeology and textual analysis, has never fully cracked it. Oracles, which we discussed earlier in the context of fate and prophecy, were also a core part of religious practice, not just dramatic plot devices in myths about doomed kings, but active institutions that ordinary people, generals, and entire city governments consulted on real decisions. Before founding a colony, before going to war, before making a major political decision, it was common practice to send representatives to Delphi or one of the other oracle sites to seek divine guidance. And the responses, however ambiguous, carried enormous weight in shaping actual historical events. Religion, in other words, wasn't just a backdrop to Greek history, it was an active participant in it, shaping decisions at the highest levels of state. Now, with that fuller picture of Greek religious life in mind, let's return to the story of Rome. Because the relationship between Greece and Rome turns out to be one of the most fascinating dynamics in all of ancient history, a case where the conqueror was, in crucial ways, conquered right back. By the early 2nd century before the Common Era, Rome had already absorbed the Greek cities of southern Italy and Sicily, the region the Greeks themselves had called Magna Graecia, Great Greece, centuries earlier when they founded those colonies. Rome's expansion eastward brought it into direct contact, and eventually conflict, with the Hellenistic kingdoms we discussed, the Macedonian monarchy that still controlled the Greek mainland, the Seleucid kingdom in the east, and the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt. The fighting was, in some respects, one-sided. Roman legions, built around a flexible system of smaller tactical units called maniples rather than the rigid Macedonian phalanx, proved remarkably effective against the very military system that had once conquered the known world under Alexander. At the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE, the Roman army decisively defeated the Macedonian king, and within a few decades, mainland Greece itself, including Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and the other city-states whose stories we've followed throughout this entire journey, came under direct Roman control. But here is where the story takes its remarkable turn, because the Romans themselves were the first to recognize, often with a mixture of admiration and anxiety, just how thoroughly Greek culture was about to colonize them in return. Educated Romans had long looked to Greece as the source of philosophy, literature, art, medicine, and rhetoric, and once Greece came under Roman political control, this cultural admiration only intensified. Wealthy Roman families sent their sons to study in Athens, the same city that had once produced Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Roman temples began to be decorated with Greek-style sculpture, and in many cases with actual Greek sculptures looted as spoils of war and shipped back to adorn Roman public spaces and private villas. Roman religion itself underwent a profound transformation, with the old Roman gods, who had originally been more abstract, less personified forces, becoming merged with their Greek counterparts. The Roman god Jupiter absorbed the mythology and personality of Zeus. Roman Juno took on the character of Hera. Roman Mars became identified with Ares. Roman Venus with Aphrodite, Roman Mercury with Hermes, Roman Neptune with Poseidon, and so on down the line, until the entire Roman pantheon was, for all practical purposes, the Greek pantheon wearing Latin names. The myths we've spent so much time exploring, the Titanomachy, the labors of Heracles, the Trojan War, the tragic stories of Oedipus and Jason and Medea. All of these were absorbed wholesale into Roman culture, retold by Roman poets, depicted on Roman art, and passed down through Roman literature to medieval Europe and ultimately to us. The Roman poet Horace captured this dynamic in a famous line, observing that conquered Greece took her fierce conqueror captive and brought the arts into rustic Rome. And it's hard to overstate how literally true this was. Roman literature in its golden age was deeply, sometimes almost obsessively, modeled on Greek precedents. The Roman epic poet Virgil, writing under the Emperor Augustus, composed the Aeneid, a national epic for Rome that consciously echoed Homer's Iliad and Odyssey in structure and style. And that took as its hero none other than Aeneas, the Trojan prince we mentioned earlier escaping the burning city of Troy, whose descendants, according to the myth, would eventually found Rome itself. Think about what that means. The Romans, in crafting their own foundational national epic, didn't invent a brand new mythology from scratch. They reached back into the Greek mythological tradition and grafted their own origins directly onto it, making themselves, in a sense, the heirs of Troy, and therefore participants in the same mythological universe as the Greek gods and heroes we've followed throughout this entire story. Roman philosophy, too, was thoroughly Greek in its foundations, with schools of thought like Stoicism and Epicureanism, both originally Greek philosophical movements. Becoming enormously influential among Roman elites, including emperors, Roman medicine looked to Greek physicians like Hippocrates and later Galen as foundational authorities. Roman education for the upper classes was conducted partly in Greek, with educated Romans expected to be bilingual, fluent in both Latin and Greek, and to be familiar with Greek literature as a mark of culture and sophistication. So when we talk about the rise of Rome and the end of Greek political independence, we have to be careful about what that ending actually meant, because in the realm of ideas, religion, art, and storytelling, nothing really ended at all. It simply changed vehicles. The myths continued to be told, now in Latin as well as Greek, illustrated by Roman as well as Greek artists, performed in Roman theaters as well as Greek ones. The philosophical schools continued to operate, now attracting Roman students alongside Greek ones. The gods continued to be worshipped, now under new names, but with essentially the same personalities, the same stories, the same relationships to one another that we explored at the very beginning of this journey. When Zeus overthrew Cronus and claimed Olympus, when Athena sprang fully formed from her father's head, when Poseidon and Athena competed for the patronage of a city that would one day give its name to an entire age of human achievement, and when the Roman Empire itself eventually transitioned, centuries later, into a Christian empire, even then, Greek mythology didn't simply vanish. It persisted in literature, in art, in language, in the very names we still use for planets, for psychological concepts, for constellations in the night sky. Every time someone describes a vulnerable weak point as an Achilles heel, every time someone refers to a long and difficult journey as an Odyssey, every time a company calls itself by a name borrowed from Greek myth, hoping to invoke ideas of victory or wisdom or power, that's the Greek world reaching across more than 2,500 years to touch the present moment. Think back to where we began this journey, with a small, rocky, fragmented landscape of mountains and islands scattered across a brilliant blue sea. A landscape so difficult to farm and so easy to sail around that it produced almost as if by necessity a civilization of independent, fiercely competitive city-states, each developing its own character, its own institutions, its own contributions to what would become a shared cultural inheritance. From that landscape came the idea that ordinary citizens could govern themselves through debate and voting rather than submitting to the absolute will of a king, an idea that, however limited and imperfect in its original Athenian form, would echo through every subsequent experiment in democratic government. From that landscape came the idea that the natural world operates according to discoverable laws and principles, that careful observation and logical reasoning could explain phenomena that earlier peoples had attributed purely to the whims of gods, an idea that, even as it coexisted with deep religious devotion, planted the seeds of what would eventually become science. From that landscape came theater as we understand it, the convention of actors performing scripted stories before an audience, exploring questions of justice, fate, identity, and human suffering in ways that still feel emotionally immediate today. And from that landscape came an entire mythology, a vast interconnected web of gods, monsters, heroes, and tragic figures. Stories that were never meant to be taken as literal history in the way we understand history, but that captured something true about human nature anyway, about ambition and its costs, about the tension between fate and free will, about love and loss and the longing for home, about the strange mixture of grandeur and vulnerability that defines the human condition. What's perhaps most remarkable, looking back over everything we've covered, is how the history and the mythology of ancient Greece were never really separate stories at all, but two threads woven through the same tapestry. The Greeks who fought at Marathon and Thermopylae grew up hearing the same stories about Achilles and Hector that we've explored here, and those stories shaped how they understood courage, glory, and sacrifice in their own lives and deaths. The philosophers who sat in the agora questioning the nature of justice and the soul lived in a city whose temples were filled with images of the very gods and heroes whose stories had been told for centuries before philosophy as a formal discipline even existed. The playwrights who wrote the tragedies that still move audiences today were drawing on mythological material that their entire audience already knew by heart, reworking ancient stories to comment on contemporary politics and morality. History shaped myth, and myth shaped how people understood and made history, in a continuous loop that ran for well over 1,000 years before Rome ever entered the picture, and that has continued, in different forms, for more than 2,000 years since. The Greeks gave the world a vocabulary for thinking about almost everything: government, tragedy, comedy, philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and an enormous cast of characters, gods and monsters and heroes, whose stories continue to be retold, adapted, reimagined, and discovered for the first time by new audiences in every generation. And that, in the end, might be the truest measure of what ancient Greece accomplished. Not just that it built temples and fought wars and produced philosophers, all of which it certainly did, but that it created a world of ideas and stories so rich, so adaptable, and so deeply attuned to something permanent in human experience, that thousands of years later, people are still listening, still curious, still finding something new in the ancient tales of gods on Olympus, heroes on distant battlefields, and a small, rocky corner of the Mediterranean that changed the course of human history forever.